Joining us now, New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker, also NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans, and professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan, Justin Wolfers. Peter, I'm going to get to you on what happened to the External Revenue Service in a moment, but I want to start with you, Christine, on what we've seen happening today and why it feels like a win, yes, but it's still very confusing and unclear why the trade war ever started to begin with.
Yeah, we've seen the president step back from what he said was needed and necessary to bring manufacturing back to the United States and remake global trade. And it was something that obviously the consensus on Wall Street was that it was a bad idea, the trade policy. And so you had seen the fits and starts on Wall Street for 6 weeks now. Now you've got the Dow back where it was before Liberation Day in the Rose Garden.
Which is good if you are looking at your 401k today. That journey has been
something. But you do have the Chamber of Commerce, for example, saying, while we are so glad the president stepped back from the worst of these tariffs, they said we still think that there should be provisions for different industries to opt out so they don't lose jobs, and reminding people this is still much higher tariff levels than the U.S. is used to.
How do you plan for this 90-day pause if you are a business that manufactures overseas and you need to figure out what sort of stock you need for the holiday season and what price you should be putting on it?
I mean, do you try to go to Cambodia or India, but you don't know what those tariffs are going to be, because another pause deadline is the beginning of July for new tariffs on those countries as well. So as a business, I don't know how you really plan when it's really trade policy in fits and starts. So there's much relief that the president has backed off these big tariffs, the worst of these tariffs. He did say today also in the Oval Office that he doesn't think if this pause expires, he'd go back all the way up to 145%. So
what is it, 130%?
So unclear. And again, that lack of clarity is something that's difficult as a business owner.
Peter, can you help us understand what happened behind the scenes?
Well, look, I think everything that Christine is talking about has obviously influenced the people around the president. They don't want, obviously, to head into a global recession. They don't want to have empty shelves. He may talk about how we can get by with fewer dolls and pencils, but the truth is, shortage on consumer goods is never good politics. So, you can make the argument, and I think his people do make the argument, this is all part of his technique of negotiating. You go high at the beginning, you act tough, you beat your chest. You say, I'm going to absolutely destroy you with these monster tariffs. And then you sit down and actually start to cut deals that bring it back down to normal or closer to normal. But I think you're right, Katie, to point out that this is still not normal, right? And Christine and Justin are smarter about this than I am. But it seems to me that a 30% tariff is still a 30% potential increase in the cost of goods. Or let's say even half of that is passed along to the consumer. Let's just say it's 15% higher prices on consumer goods. That's higher than the highest inflation rate during the Biden presidency. And inflation was one of the things that killed Biden's presidency politically. So, 30% is obviously a whole lot different than 145%. I think what people are taking from that is a sign of a de-escalation, and they hope for a further de-escalation. But let's remember that 30%, as you rightly said, Katie, is still a big deal.
But what about the External Revenue Service? Because Donald Trump, in levying these tariffs, touted this idea that we would have so much money coming into the country because of these tariffs, the tax on other nations, he argued, that we would be able to get rid of income taxes for maybe just the middle class. Is that no longer being discussed?
I mean, look, if your goal is to have tariffs stay high, then in theory, you can bring in some revenue, right? But if you have zero ships coming from China, and remember on Friday, there was a 12-hour period reported there was zero ships leaving Chinese ports to bring consumer goods to West Coast ports, that means you're not going to collect tariffs because nobody's bringing in any imports. So you're not going to get those high in the sky, pie in the sky revenue in, estimates that the president liked to throw out there if you're not actually importing goods, because people don't want to pay that much more for goods. And that's part of the point, is he has contradictory goals here. Is the goal to collect money and replace the income tax, in which case that's one thing? Or is the goal to set tariffs so high that you spur domestic manufacturing and economic growth, which is a different thing, in which you wouldn't be collecting tariffs. You'd be, in fact, using tariffs as a barrier to anything actually coming in. And he talks at different times in both ways, right? That the goal is actually just to stimulate domestic manufacturing and economic growth again, or the goal is to bring in money. But in the end, it's really going to be one or the other.
Justin, is there any way to make sense of this? In the most generous terms, is there any way to look at this to say, yeah, this was a good thing, Donald Trump won something for the American people?
So there's no way of making sense of the whole theatre, the drama from start to finish. We started off with pretty low tariffs with the rest of the world. We escalated them and then we brought them down a little bit. So we've undone some of the damage that the president did, but by no means all of it. Can you make sense of what happened overnight? Absolutely. This is terrific news. Secretary Bessent said that both sides sat in the room and they realised that they didn't want to decouple, which basically saying we don't want all the chaos of having to find other trading partners, and I think he's absolutely right about that. One might ask, why did you bother starting the decoupling if you don't want to finish it? But I'm glad they're not going to finish it. I'm glad we're actually going to keep doing business in a more productive way.
What is the win here, though, Justin? I mean, the tariffs got raised to astronomically high levels. The stock market went nuts. Supply chains were disrupted. They're being brought back down. Where is the win? What did Donald Trump get out of this negotiation?
So let me answer you directly and then come back to something. The direct answer is, if we had just gone directly to this outcome, President Trump got elected and said, I want to put tariffs on China of about, what he said, and about 30% and 10% on the rest of the world, we probably, not certainly, but probably wouldn't be staring down a recession right now. I want to come back to Katie. I don't want to score any of this as who wins and who loses.
Okay.
So realize the president's biggest cudgel when he meets with the Chinese is he says, I'm going to put a 30% tariff on you, China. But he's not. He's putting a 30% tax on Americans. He's making it more expensive for American businesses to get the inputs they need to be competitive on the rest of the world. He's making it harder for mums and dads to get by. So that's why I don't want to talk about wins and losses, because basically if we can sort things out with our neighbours and friends, we can all cooperate and make the pie bigger. And that's a beautiful thing. What Trump had been doing was disrupting that cooperation. What he's done overnight is allowed a little bit more of it to sneak through. That's good for China and good for America. And it's okay, it's good for China.
I mean, China was in a dire position as well. It's not good for China to have zero ships leaving to bring goods to America. China is a country that relies much more on exporting than consuming. It's not a consumer culture the way that we are a consumer culture. It's not as they don't want it as much. The Chinese government doesn't want it as much. I want to ask about manufacturing, because one of the other goals that Donald Trump said was he wanted to rehome U.S. manufacturing. Does this maintain that incentive for U.S. manufacturers? And
it's something that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said. He said on a series of media appearances this morning that, that generalized decoupling is not a good idea, and both sides realize that. But there needs to be strategic decoupling, and that's in steel and semiconductors and things that are really important for the United States. They still would like to make sure they make those investments that were revealed during COVID, by the way, that remember when we couldn't get stuff because we didn't make really important stuff for our supply chains. So this White House still wants to make sure there is decoupling in some sectors, like steel, like semiconductors, and they're going to continue to pursue that in these discussions.
I want to play one moment that caught my attention because, again, when you're talking about invasion of the body snatchers, you would wonder how this could come out of somebody who claims they're a Republican's mouth. This is Donald Trump talking about redistribution of wealth.
The numbers are, for the healthcare company, not as bad as you would think. They'll make the same. I think the healthcare companies should make pretty much the same money. I really don't believe they should be affected very much because it's just a redistribution of wealth. It's a redistribution where it could be the same top line, but it's going to be distributed differently. Europe's going to have to pay a little bit more. The rest of the world's going to have to pay a little bit more, and America's going to pay a lot less.
So a little backstory here. This is about Donald Trump talking about lowering prescription drug prices. He signed an executive order this morning saying that he was going to immediately lower prescription drug prices. They have to cost the same as the lowest cost anywhere else in the country. And I'll ask you about that move, Peter. But first, I do have to ask, hearing a Republican president talk about redistribution of wealth really caught me off guard.
Yeah, look, this is a reflection of how much our politics have changed, right? How did Donald Trump get elected last year? He got elected in part by appealing to people who, typically normally would have gone Democratic in the past, who in fact are concerned about, economics and the how the upper class has managed to do so well when they feel like they've been left behind. He has appealed to that sense of populist, grievance out there. And so when he talks about redistribution of wealth, he's talking to his base in that sense. It sounds odd because it's not what we're used to, as you rightly said, from Republicans over recent years, but there is a strain of politics today that has shifted voters and shifted thinking about these things. Look, protectionism never used to be a Republican virtue either. That was always a Democratic ideal and not something that a Republican ever would have put in place. But Donald Trump has scrambled the equation on politics, economics, and so much else.
Let me ask you then about the mere fact that he signed this executive order. Where did this come from? He tried it last administration. It didn't work. There were lawsuits that stopped it. What authority does he have? And I think everybody would want this, but what authority does he actually have to unilaterally force private companies to lower prescription drug costs here in the United States? Peter.
Yeah, this is also something Republicans would have traditionally, backed away from. The idea of a government telling private sectors how to do its business is not traditionally a Republican, philosophy. But in this case, again, he's appealing to that populist sentiment out there. There are plenty of Democrats who would agree that drug companies are not, treating customers fairly in this country and that prices need to come down. That is a bipartisan consensus in that sense. Whether this will do it seems unlikely. He hasn't been able to identify the legal authority in which he could actually do this. As you say, the drug companies aren't going to simply go along with it without a fight. We'll see what happens, but it's meant to appeal to those people out there, Americans out there, who feel like they have been gouged by drug makers over the years and are looking for government to do something about it.